Okay, I'd like to go ahead and get started. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone who's still here for participating. My name is Hal Walls. I'm from Clarion Corporation, and I'll be your moderator for today's discussion. We have 4 industry experts who will lead us through a discussion of how microgrids, solar power, wind power, and battery storage technology will impact the reciprocating engine business. So the format for today's panel, it's more a discussion, will be each panel member will be asked 2 questions. At the very end, we'll have a Q&A period. And of course, afterwards, the presentation and the panel members will be available for any questions or comments or discussion that you may have. Okay. So I'd like to quickly get started. So we got really lucky with Tucker Carlson. He came in, and I think everybody had a blast listening to him. But when we talk about alternative energy or renewables, we have to keep in mind that what plays the most important key role is how the policy is going to be set in the future. And our politicians, they set the policy. So here, I've got on the left Hillary, and her position represents pretty much the position of most people on the left, is that they want renewable energy as soon as possible. They can't get fast enough, and they want to move away from the coal and oil and gas, which TC Ted Cruz is a proponent of on the right. He calls it the all-above strategy. And that same goes for the other 2 candidates we have here, Kasich and Bernie. I almost said Barney Frank. Bernie Sanders. I shouldn't get those 2 confused, right? But basically the same position. So, I showed 4 candidates, but there's one more we're missing, and I think it's one of our favorites. And this guy, he was asked, and I looked long and hard for this. I tried to find the most, I'm not going to say quotable quote, but something that really brought to light his stance on alternative energy. So I found a conversation between our buddy Trump and a 12-year-old girl. And Trump, in his most Trump-like fashion, the girl says, the poor girl said, she just asked about fossil fuel and wind power and what's the difference and how is it going to affect things, and Trump gave a Trump-like response. You gotta love it. But you know what? I think Tucker Carlson said this. He said that we don't always know what Trump is thinking. So I'm hoping that Trump was actually thinking this. All right, but what are our EGSA members thinking? What are they asking? Well, they look at the headlines. They see what we just talked about, the political landscape. And I'm not going to read all these things, but I'll just say the bottom line is they're thinking is how will alternative energy affect me and my business going forward? I mean, that's the key, and that's what we're here today to discuss. Okay? And with that, I'll go right into our first panel member, Steve Evans, and we'll talk about microgrids. So Steve, let me give you your first question, okay? Steve, can you start us off by explaining what is a microgrid and how does it relate to the smart grid of the future?
Well, thanks, Al, for that totally random question. How many of you have installed a generator? Okay, if you've installed a generator, you've installed a microgrid. The biggest qualifier seems to be the ability to operate independently. As you've seen from hospitals and data centers and industrial plants, the ability to just operate independently makes this unit a microgrid. There may be other things in that microgrid that are other features and functions, and those include such things as generator management and load management. We've done this for years. This is nothing new, okay? The changes might be the ability to handle an external signal from the utility to shed the non-critical loads. But load management and generator management you've been doing for years, right, to keep our system stable. Also, we've the ability to handle and support the grid in times of constraint. And supporting the grid in times of constraint can be both in the form of exporting power to the grid or switching your energy management to a discharge mode. And the last is ability to manage intermittent power generation. So these are the common features that seem to go into a microgrid. So once you have these systems operating and the microgrids of the power plant, the data center, and the industrial complex, and when the power goes out in the area, they can supply the local area surrounding these three microgrids. So for lack of a better term, we also call that a microgrid. So as we stack the microgrids together, they become a smart grid. So it's really not a geographic consideration. The city of Fort Collins, Colorado calls themselves a microgrid. It's really more a function and feature set that creates what a smart grid is.
Okay. Well, Steve, thanks for answering that first and totally random question. Your second question is, now that you've gone over microgrids and smart grids, when you think of renewable technologies, do you see them as a threat or an opportunity to Rice DG, our reciprocating engine business?
Well, thank you. The simple answer is yes, but you know I can't let it go that easy, right?
No, I can't.
Actually, I see that there are threats to the industry today. Light Sail Technologies, an outfit out of California doing stored energy in the form of compressed air using race car engines and synchronous generators. Okay, they're taking a direct aim at your industry right from their website, diesel engines. Okay, they want to replace your engine with this new technology. The next are fuel cells. Bloom Energy has come along, and they're going to replace generators and UPSs with their fuel cells. They recently had a finding that was not in their favor, actually. They were not allowed subsidies and incentives because of, they claim they're a renewable energy, but they really consume hydrocarbons, so they're not a renewable energy. And they recently had a finding not in their favor, so that might impact their business model some. But they've been successful. They've got Google, FedEx, Coca-Cola, eBay, Yahoo, Walmart, are all customers of Bloom and have used their systems there. The third one I see out there in the market is Orison and Tesla. A recent article in Powerline, we talked about the Tesla firewall or Powerwall. Put it in your garage to back up your house, give you about 2 days of power for about $23,000. Probably not the most economic when you compare it to a 20 kW gas genset at $5,000, right? Plus, I'm not sure I'd like a wall full of hoverboard batteries in my garage. So the fact that they're the energy storage that they're aimed right at the residential market. Next is consider that it's getting tougher to get permits in some cases, and so whether it be sound, whether it be fuel storage, whether it be just emissions, it's getting tougher and tougher to get the permits, which also is a detriment to this Rice business. The next will be energy costs are going up, okay? The estimates are between 200% and 400% increase in energy rates in the next few years. Those increases in costs are going to drive people to other alternatives. This is happening today in Hawaii, okay? People are coming off the grid in droves in Hawaii, installing solar and energy storage and getting totally off the grid. And that leaves the grid people to charge even more, the utility company to charge even more to who's ever left. So it's a cascading situation that's rapidly advancing in Hawaii and those places. The next will be some businesses are changing their business model. We've seen data centers go to migration where they're moving the software away from your request to go to one data center. There's no genset at that data center. If it loses power, it runs off its UPSs for a few minutes, and then your next request goes to a different data center some other place. It's called software migration. Just learned from our experts in ASCO that Microsoft didn't have much luck at this, and so they're going back and adding gensets again to the sites they tried this at. But it won't be too long until they get that figured out, I think. And also healthcare centers moving away from the traditional hospital into more of the outpatient day use kind of centers. But on the bright side, I see a tremendous opportunity for our industry. okay? You guys are the experts. Your customers come to you with questions every day. The providers, the manufacturers are trusted in the industry for your skills and knowledge and equipment. So you're the backup power experts. And I think in many cases, adding renewable energy to a system isn't going to be too difficult. The controls for a power system using solar and wind will be relatively easy at low penetration levels. So they're also going to require configuration. So I see all these as opportunities for you people and you power system experts out there in this new market. I encourage us all to think of backup energy, not just backup power. Integrate combined heat and power. We talked about CHP the other day, right? And combined heat and power, storage, both energy storage and thermal energy storage as an overall energy solution for your customers. I think that'll help. Also, the change in perception in politics. Right now, we have regulations in our favor. The NFPA 110 requires reciprocating engines to be the alternate power source. Next, and the regulations are in our favor. And why do I say that diesel is cleaner than coal? Well, I did a quick study on the backup power and looking at a 1960s era power plant in Coffeen, Illinois. They were recognized for being low emissions. Their numbers came out to be about 32% efficient. If you deliver the power to your door, it's 25%. A RICE DG, a Tier 4 CAT DG RICE unit runs about 35% already, and emissions are actually a third less for looking at CO2 over coal. So hopefully we can change this. Cost, it's another factor, and that's changing. But I claim that diesel is actually cleaner than coal with today's diesels.
Okay. Thank you, Steve. So now let's move on to solar power, and we have a first-timer with us today, John Palermo of Challenger Electric. John, for your first question, I'd like to ask you, what are the main types of solar photovoltaic systems that are popular in rural areas, and what roles, if any, do engine-driven electrical generators play in the reliability of those systems?
Thank you for that question, Hal. And first off, it is John Palermo, not John Palmer, as is shown here, just a goof. And the other thing I want to impress on you folks is the previous speaker who spoke so much about that tragedy, the Challenger accident. I just want you to know Challenger Electric had nothing to do with that. Now that's in the clear. Let's first talk about 4 systems that I am most familiar with in the photovoltaic world, also known as PV systems. First system we'll talk about is a grid tie system. The grid tie system is the simplest and most economical of the 4 systems we'll discuss. It has only 2 major components. It has a simplex inverter and a solar array. These 2 components, basically when tied into the utility grid, will allow you to sell excess energy back to the power company, although not always at favorable rates. So the downside to this system is when the grid goes down, by law, that simplex inverter must go down also. You're out of power, unless you have some form of backup generation, such as a RICE-driven generator. The second type of system we'll talk about is very, very similar to that first grid tie system. It's called a hybrid or a hybrid grid tie. This particular system has a more complex inverter, and it has generally a larger solar array, and it uses a storage system that is traditionally comprised of lead-acid batteries or AGM batteries. However, storage systems are changing. This system has the advantages of being able to supply power for some of your loads when that particular grid goes down. So the third type of system that we will talk about is a standalone system, also known as off-grid. As the name implies, you're not tied into the grid at all. You are your own power manager. With this system, you will have larger inverters, generally a larger storage system, and you will also have usually a larger array. Advantages to this system are obvious. You're not dependent on the grid whatsoever. This specific system is the one that is most apt to use a RICE-driven generator behind it. Otherwise, when the solar goes down, you would just flat be out of power. The fourth system we'll talk about is gaining in popularity. It is a grid assist system. This particular system is a system that is generally considered a standalone, only it does have grid tie only for backing up the solar. You cannot sell. So with this type system, if the solar system goes down, the grid will back it up, or if the solar system can't provide enough energy, it doesn't have to be down. The grid will back that system up. If you tie in a RICE-driven generator with this type system, you have the most reliable of all the systems talked about. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Now for your second question. Piggybacking off of the description you just gave of the 4 types of photovoltaic systems, what are the current trends and incentives for each type of system, and how will this affect the engine-driven power supply industry in the future?
Thanks again, Hal. So when we talk about trends and incentives and the effect it'll have on our generator industry, the first thing we want to take a look at is grid ties and to some extent hybrid. These type systems are very, very dependent on the political climate and state, local, and federal legislation. To begin with, things were very favorable for these systems, but there are changes happening. Power companies have a lot of say in what goes on. And the phenomenon of what's called net metering pretty much stated for the first portion, or the last decade, we'll say, that the power company would pay you retail rates for the energy you sold to them. That is in the process of changing in a fair amount of communities, and I expect those changes to continue. So the changes, how do they end up now? Basically, the power company will be allowed to pay you for your surplus energy their wholesale rates. Somewhere in the neighborhoods, it really varies, but somewhere in the neighborhoods of 1/6 of what they were previously paying you. This has tremendous impact on a grid tie and a hybrid system in that the payback period is extended way off in the future. The effect on this, I think, and for the generators that are used to back up these systems, will be somewhat negative. So, again. Okay. So with that, when we start to look at the other systems that are associated with it, these first 2 systems were grid tied. Now we'll move into off-grid and standalone systems and even grid assist. When you talk about off-grid systems and the trends that are developing, some of the influences aren't quite so much the political spectrum, but they have to do with the costs of electricity, which, as we all know, are rising, and also the cost to extend the grid to a remote location that is previously maybe a little less expensive. Well, PV system cost is going down. Grid system extensions are going up. So there will be a greater use of the off-grid and grid assist systems. With this, you will find, I think, an increase in the need for our product to back these systems up. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So let's keep moving right along and move on to wind power and wind energy with Mike Berge of Berge Wind Power Company. So Mike, we'd like to ask you, what are the things the engine-driven generator industry should know about distributed wind?
Thank you, Hal. First, I'd like to express my appreciation to EGSA for inviting me to participate. I've learned a tremendous amount here, and it gives me an opportunity to show you what we feel in the distributed wind industry is an emerging large-scale opportunity for your industry, which I understand sort of goes against the conventional wisdom. So I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to be here for this. So distributed wind is behind the meter. It's at schools, homes, public facilities, commercial facilities, farms in particular. And so you have a wide range of customers and suppliers in our industry. The turbine scales can range from a couple of kilowatts up to a couple of megawatts, but they're always sized behind the meter for the customer's load. So this is not merchant power. We're not trying to earn income from selling power to the power grid. At the smaller scale, there is net metering, so there is bankability on excess power, but the machines are sized for the load. The things that I'd like you to know about wind power are, first of all, that the power in the wind varies with the cube of the velocity, so that both the performance instantaneously and the economics long-term are exponential with the wind resource. So we go to windy areas, and there are areas where there's not enough wind. You need space, so it's a rural residential, a commercial and industrial market. It's not in the suburbs, it's not in the cities. You need height. You have to get up above the turbulence and the ground effects. And so if you see a wind turbine on a short tower, somebody has believed what they read on the internet and spent their money poorly. Reliability and ruggedness and longevity are product specific. So you have to be a smart shopper. You have to go around, look for track records, look for certification to the national and international standards. And I would even suggest look for membership if you're shopping here in America, for membership in the Distributed Wind Energy Association, because we don't let the bozos and the shysters in our group. And finally, there is a 30% federal tax credit and 5-year depreciation, which does help with the economics. Speaking of costs, the CapEx is dependent upon scale. So the smaller systems are more expensive than the larger systems. They range from about $4,000 to $8,000 currently, but the costs are coming down rapidly. And so, you know, the target costs are about 50% of what we have today, but I can tell you that the industry is well ahead of that curve, and we're probably going to see 20–30% drops within the next 2 years. And then in terms of life cycle cost, we're in the range of 10 to 28 cents currently, but we're talking about reductions as high as 75% within the next 15 years. And again, the industry is really it's seeing a lot of competition from imported solar modules, and so there's a great amount of investment in new technology to reduce the costs. And the final thing I'd say on this is that whereas most of the solar modules are imported, most of the small wind turbines and medium-scale wind turbines sold in America are built here. Over 90% of them are. Oops. Oh, we didn't get a blank in there? Okay.
That's all right. Okay. Well, let's just move on to your second part of your second question. First, thanks for giving us that information on the cost. I think we all appreciate that. And as we think about cost and things that affect our future, could you give us your perspective on the future? And will more wind system sales, what will that mean for the generator business, the generator market?
Well, first, I'm going to project that Donald Trump's going to have a hard time explaining why the Audubon Society is such a strong supporter of wind power. But, you know, maybe that'll come up in the debates. No, I see a tremendous opportunity for partnership and for expanded markets in combination with wind for your industry. And the reason why I say that is because if you look at the characteristics of wind power and solar power, they're very complementary with the characteristics of your generators in terms of capital costs, operating costs, logistics burden, maintenance requirements, and availability, and particularly availability. They're complementary. So together they make a more robust and affordable system, and that's valuable to consumers and to utilities. Our industry brings a 40-year track record. They now call them microgrids. We used to call them village power systems or telecom systems, off-grid telecom systems. But there's a very rich history of operation at tens of thousands of sites all over the world and in every state in the country of combined systems, and that can be brought to bear. The architecture for the that is of most interest here, and John covered the other architectures that also wind power utilizes, but the one that's particularly relevant, I think, is the hybrid system that combines storage and a backup generator. We use these for village power and telecommunications. When we do that, we can cut the diesel runtime, and I say diesel, but it could be another fuel, by down to 10 to 25%. We save 80% of the fuel, and typically on an annual basis, it's 50 to 90% of the annual energy for the facility comes from renewables. What makes this possible are those advanced inverters that can operate independently, charge batteries. When the diesel runs, it's run at its best specific fuel consumption point so that it's efficient and it recharges the battery through the inverter. Those electronics have been on the market about 20 years, make this work very well. But if you take that basic architecture, take the batteries out and substitute your generators or keep your generators in, I see a tremendous opportunity. I live in Oklahoma. We have ice storms that bring down the power lines. And so if we can use a backup generator, we can both provide power surety to consumers and peak shaving in a distributed fashion to utilities, which is becoming much more valuable. So I really see a tremendous partnership opportunity. We're going to have somebody from EGSA come to our next meeting of our association, and we really look forward to working with your industry to sell a lot more wind turbines and engine generator sets. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Mike. And moving right along, let's go on to stored energy and battery power with Bill Kayward from SINS. So Bill, right now we're using about 3 to 5% renewable energy in the U.S., depending on how you look at it. I'm sure Steve could debate that with me a little bit longer here. But as we move toward this, you could call it a rush if you want, to distributed power, how will these alternative energy sources affect the reliability of our electrical supply?
Thanks, Al, and good morning, everybody. I wanted to step back for a moment and before we get to storage, talk a little bit about the system as a whole. On the slide now is a model from NERC, the North American Reliability Corporation, that talks about essential reliability services. And these are things like spinning reserve, frequency response, voltage support, disturbance tolerance, and so forth. These are services that we take for granted. They're provided by this very large spinning mass of at coal plants, nuclear plants, and so forth, such that when there is any perturbation, disturbance in the electric system at all, this spinning mass simply cruises right through it like a big ship through waves. And what NERC itself has said is that we have reliables, as the penetration rate increases, is reducing or will reduce the reliability of the grid. And so as you saw the Jenga tower fall apart, Jenga, if you recall, is the game of wooden blocks. You start pulling these things out, what happens? If you pull enough out, the tower collapses. So that's relevant because that forms the backdrop for the next question we're going to talk about. The next slide really talks about the smart grid. And really one of the issues that is not talked about a lot is the smart grid requires communications, near real-time communications in order to dispatch more resources. Cisco Corporation says that IP is the right protocol for the smart grid. Well, most of you know that IP is vulnerable to things like cyber attacks. And so there is a dark side to this that you need to be thinking about. David Chalk, how governments and utilities are blindly merging the power grid with the internet and effectively without any protection is insanity at its finest. Some of you may recognize the name James Woolsey. He's the former director of Central Intelligence for the United States. His comment is that a so-called smart grid that is as vulnerable as what we've got is not smart at all. It's a really, really stupid grid. Now, my point for raising these is not to be Debbie Downer up here, but everybody in this industry knows that we're about reliability. And because we're about reliability, we need to understand that some of the drive toward this new system, as we take apart the old, will create opportunities. And so think about that.
Okay. Well, Bill, I don't know, that was pretty down. Jeez. now that we're all a little concerned and freaked out about reliability, what opportunities do you see for the genset business as it relates to this shift to alternative energy resources?
In terms of opportunities, first of all, I've alluded to the first one, which is our business is about reliability. People come to us and they buy our products and services because they're concerned about uptime. The slide that's up right now is a view into the future. The country of Germany is much further down the renewable energy path than we are. And in Germany, the diagram on the left shows the renewables picture in 2012, where renewables are satisfying a portion of the peak demand. Well, in as little as 4 years, the forecast for 2020, you can see these huge swings in baseload, formerly coal, and nuclear. Nuclear will be decommissioned in Germany, and the massive production by renewables. That is a huge change because renewables have been, right today we have the luxury of adding renewables to a base load grid. What happens when renewables form base load some of the time? That's a big challenge. And according to the Germans, base load power is incompatible with intermittent renewables. So here's a pretty clear statement about the opportunity. To complement renewables, we will need dispatchable power plants that can ramp up and down relatively quickly. That means simple cycle gas turbines, because combined cycle can't ramp quickly enough. And it probably means reciprocating engines. So if we think about this country as offering a similar future, that's probably what's going to happen. And in fact, this is another NERC chart. It's rather complicated, but it shows what California is likely to look like in the year 2020. And the large yellow peak in the middle is photovoltaic production during the middle of the day. And as you can see, the photovoltaic production exceeds the load. Question one, what do you do with that excess power? Question two is, how do you meet the evening ramp? So when people get home from work, they plug in their electric cars, they cook dinner, turn on their air conditioner, and so forth. This chart shows that the ramp rate is almost 13,000 megawatts hours ramp in 3 hours. But then how, unless you generate that power, do you possibly fill that with energy storage? Well, that energy storage, the rough back of the envelope calculation is $25 to $31 billion at today's prices. Well, those lithium batteries only last 10 years, so that means every 10 years we have to invest an equivalent amount if we want to store that. So if you don't store it and recapture the energy in the evening, what do? You have to generate it, and it's got to be quick responding. That, to me, looks like a major opportunity for generation, quick response generation. So that was a little bit about storage, and I'm not going to get into lithium versus compressed air versus hydro. We don't have time, but I would point you to the Energy Storage Association. Google them. There's a lot of really interesting information if you're a gearhead and you want to learn about it. But I just want to give an example, building on what John talked about earlier, about a grid tie. This would be a small facility. It could be a residence, could be a business. Today, a net metering system has you importing power in the morning, and then you export your photovoltaic during the middle of the day. That's great when you have net metering because you're paid retail, but the utilities don't want to pay you. They want to buy power cheap, so they buy it at the 1/6 of what your retail rate would be. So because you don't want to sell cheap and you don't want to buy expensive, what you will need, the cost in the afternoon is going to soar. So in order to avoid that, you want to store that energy if you're generating your own power. So the bottom example shows instead of exporting that excess solar power during the middle of the day, we simply capture it and use it for our own evening peak. And so that's something which will be logical for many people to do as the new utility rates hit us right in the wallet. It's the American way, isn't it? And finally, in many places, air quality restrictions may prevent us from actually generating on site. That may force the storage issue as well. So that's, again, look at the Energy Storage Association if you want to look at more, but that's a quick overview.
Okay. Thanks, Bill. Turning that bad news into good news for our business, at least. It looks like backup power from rice will always be needed here. If we could just go to the next slide. I think you can click it for me, Bill. That's fine. I'm just going to go through this real quick because we're pushing our time limit a little bit and we want to get into a little Q&A. After hearing the 4 panel members talk, I think the bottom line for us is that highlighted line, that fourth one in the situation, is that, one, the concept of standby power is evolving. And when we think about that, there's opportunity there. It's just how will the members of EGSA take advantage of those opportunities? Where do you fit in? And that's what, hopefully, that some new ideas for new partnerships or new areas of business can come about by the panel and some of the things they've talked about today. So let's go ahead and move forward and get into the Q&A, if we can do that now. I think they've got the mics. There's one right in the back here.
Great presentation. Just a couple of questions. In regard to Germany, we're seeing where ratepayers are paying up to 6 times the amount we would here in certain areas for electricity, and that's one to cover the capacity that's needed when renewables aren't available, and 2 is to incentivize these renewable programs. So as we begin to grow renewables, have we learned from any of the, or are you guys seeing that we've learned from any of the mistakes that, or not mistakes, but the situation in Europe whereby we can keep these rates low but introduce renewables in a logical manner where we're not killing ratepayers?
First of all, Europe has very regulated grids, and so their rates are set up and maintained by their government, by central bodies, much different than the U.S. model. So they're able to control their rates much easier than we can in the U.S. So they forced higher rates in order to force that to happen. You guys want to comment on the rest of it? Bill?
My observation as an American and a student of history is that we tend to need to stub our toe before we ourselves learn from other people's experience. That's a personal opinion. Can't go into chapter and verse, but we're doing that again. Our rates are going to go up, and there's not a lot of discussion about how that's happening.
Well, I'll just comment that actually here in the U.S., I think the experience is that renewables are keeping rates lower than they would be otherwise. And I'll give you an example. In Oklahoma and Texas, the 20-year power purchase agreement contracts with the large-scale wind farms are typically in the 1.8 to 2.6 cents per kilowatt hour fixed. And that is the cheapest power that they can get for new capacity. And so even though it's awkward on the scheduling, and they have to have backup spinning reserve for it, they're very willing to do that. And that's why Texas has hit up to 20% on a daily penetration rate with wind power. And that's why utilities continue to buy. Energy has always been expensive in Europe. Gas is more expensive, electricity is more expensive. It's not really a fair comparison, I would say.
Are those rates you quoted in Texas, are those net of incentives?
Yeah, so the project developer takes the incentives, and then they're able to offer the lower cost to the utility as a result of that. So if you want to think about it, the incentives are really helping consumers. They help the developers, don't get me wrong, but they also help consumers.
And the rates in Texas are pretty low nationally.
First off, thank all you guys just for taking the time and explaining all this to us. Mr. Bill, I have a specific question for you when it comes to storage. How are we progressing from what you're seeing current, and what do you see as the future kind of cutting edge technology for energy storage?
I think the ESA is probably a good place to go. There's so many alternatives, and the type of storage that you choose to use will often depend on who you are. For example, if you're a water utility, you have access to plenty of water. You have access to low-cost pipe fitters, pumps, and all the equipment necessary to do that. If you can drill a big hole in the ground and move water up and down during the day, you've got cheap energy storage compared to some of the other alternatives. Compressed air, you can store energy in a salt dome by compressing it and capturing the heat as it goes in. So that's a difficult question to answer. My company would probably choose electrical storage because we tend to understand it better. But that's a question which is going to be situational for every end user.
I'd like to add, if you're considering energy storage, there's two things to look at, and that is the kilowatt hours, or the size of the gas tank, and the rate at which it goes out. So I think that by far today, the largest energy storage is pumped hydro. But again, that's not always possible with a lot of environmental or a lot of geographic considerations.
Thanks for being at this opportunity. I had the opportunity last week to spend the other half of my company's travel budget on attending the Microgrid Summit in DC. Had the opportunity to rub elbows with Department of Energy, MIT Lincoln Labs, many utility companies, and it was quite eye-opening. A few of the takeaways on the national scene from that, and this is more of a comment than a question, so please indulge me. But there is a national policy toward development of microgrids nationwide, and that is for three general purposes, and that is security, reliability, and resilience are the three stated reasons for doing that. Okay, it's stated that the microgrid market represents a $22 billion opportunity between now and the year 2020, and that on-site power generation in various forms is the backbone of microgrids. Okay, that's on the national scene. On the international scene, many developing nations are going straight to microgrids as their first source of power, and everything from the simplest systems such as Bill described to very elaborate ones. I learned just last night in speaking with a colleague that the third most populous nation by the year 2020 will be Nigeria in the world, and the opportunity there is going to be staggering. So there is opportunity. I think that this group, EGSA, represents the finest minds in our industry. I think that the absolute thinking power And the abilities that are contained in this auspicious group represent the leadership that can bring all associated industries into the microgrid of the future, including the ones that are sitting on the panel. And the missing element that's not represented on the panel is obviously the grid itself, the utility companies in their various shapes and forms. So not as a challenge, but as a suggestion, President Bill, where are you? You have the opportunity to lead us into the future. Thank you.
Okay. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. That's our last question. We're actually out of time. Our panel will be available afterwards for Q&A and discussion. And I'd like to thank our panel and give them a round of applause and thank you for everything they've done today.